and clear answer about, just how decisive a win was. So in this first slide, I want to show you basically what I've done here. I've looked at the last 10 elections and looked at 4 different ways on which we could kind of assess the margin. And these are listed from the most decisive to the least decisive. I chose the last 10 elections because I thought it was a good comparison. Interestingly enough, it's the 10 elections I have voted in. So that gives you a little bit about my age. But first of all, if we look at electoral votes, which is the most obvious, which is the only thing that really matters, Biden's election was maybe not all that spectacular. Basically had 306, which is places him 7th out of 10. Actually, he and Trump in 2016 won the same amount, but Biden has a slight lead here because 2 faithless electors did not vote for Trump in 2016. If we move to the second column, popular vote margin, again, you can look at this in different ways. But here, Biden goes up a little bit. His margin was very similar to the 1988 electoral margin of George H.W. Bush. In fact, 7.08 to 7.06. If you look at popular vote percentage, interestingly enough, only 6 of the last 10 winning presidents had a 50% or more popular vote. But you can see even there, Biden actually outdid a couple of those who got 50%. He did better than Obama in 2012 and Bush in 2004. And then if you look at popular vote percentage, or the margin between the two, the margin between the percentages, Biden kind of towards the middle of the list at about almost 4.5%. Now note, if you look at Trump in 2016, obviously almost the exact same number as Biden at the bottom in terms of popular vote margin, next to last popular vote, and next and dead last in popular vote percentage margin. So our preliminary answer is to the question of how decisive was Biden's victory. We can say that it wasn't a landslide, it wasn't a nail biter, it's kind of somewhere in between. Okay? Now, if we look at kind of a different way of looking at this question, we can see that in at least one way, Biden's victory was actually fairly impressive. And this is the overall percentage of Americans voting for the candidate. And you get this by taking the percentage of the popular vote that was won and multiplying it by voter turnout. And basically what that gives you is what percentage of American voters actually voted for that candidate. So you can see in the table, because Biden had a fairly good percentage of the popular vote, and because turnout was extremely high in the November election, a higher percentage of American voters actually voted for Biden than any of the 10 most recent elections. At 34.2%, was actually higher than Obama in 2008, Reagan in 1984. So in that sense, the actual number of Americans who voted for that candidate, he's actually at the top. I want to say a couple of things about the voter turnout. One is that I use something called VEP, which is called voter eligible population. You may see slightly different numbers if someone had used VAP, which is voting age population. The difference between the two is obviously that the VEP, voting eligible, takes out those who are not eligible. Maybe they're not citizens, maybe they're felons whose voting rights have not been restored, et cetera. And the second point I want to make, and if you have questions about this, please ask. You might say, why did the voter turnout jump up so much in 2020? Well, political scientists don't have an answer for you yet. I'm sure there'll be numerous articles written in the years to come about this, but it wasn't just that there was so much mail-in voting. And the reason I say that is because if you look back to 2018 voter turnout jumped from 36% in 2014 to 50% in 2018, a 14% jump for the midterm elections. Usually when you see that, you're going to see a somewhat corresponding jump in the presidential election, and that is what we saw here. In 2016, the voter turnout was 59.2, and it jumped 7.5 points to 66.7. So the voter turnout jump was actually kind of predicted by many political scientists even before the pandemic, simply because of the jump we saw in turnout in the midterms in 2018. So, point being, Biden's victory in this sense was pretty impressive. However, there was another way in which Biden's victory was not all that impressive, and in fact wasn't even as impressive as 2016. And this is the votes to decide the Electoral College. So if you total up the votes in all the states that the winning candidate, if you kind of go back and see what states he could have lost and gone back to, say, 270, how many votes would it take for his opponent, the opposing candidate, to get to 270 electoral votes? So in 2020, Biden won Georgia by 11,000 plus. He won Arizona by 10,000 plus. He won Wisconsin by 20,000 plus. Those were the three closest states. But then there's Nebraska's second district. Now, as some of you may know, Maine and Nebraska divide up their electoral votes by congressional district. You get 2 for winning each state, and then any remaining votes the state has go to people who won the various congressional districts. Nebraska is a fairly strong Republican state, and Trump won Nebraska by a fairly large margin. However, in the area around Omaha, Omaha is an urban area. Like many urban areas in the United States, it has become increasingly Democratic over the past few years. The second district of Nebraska is almost entirely Omaha and its suburbs. And as you can see, Biden won that district fairly convincingly. He actually won it by more votes than the three closest states. Interestingly enough, in Maine, a rural district went for Trump, so it kind of balanced out. But anyway, if you add all that up, it's about 65,000 votes. That is less than the 77,000 votes that Hillary Clinton would have needed to reverse Trump's win in 2016. So in that sense, 2020 was closer. Perhaps that's the only sense it was a closer election. And I put 2012 up there for comparison because you see in 2012, Obama, or Romney, I guess, would have needed over 500,000 votes, 6 states, to have that go the other way. And you may wonder, well, if Biden actually won a slightly higher percentage of the popular vote than Obama did in 2012, why is it that the electoral vote was so close this time as opposed to 2012 when it wasn't very close at all? Well, that basically had to do with the distribution of votes. Distribution of votes in 2012 were more equally distributed across the states. Obama's votes were more efficient in a sense, and there weren't as many wasted votes. And what I mean by wasted votes is Biden ran up huge margins in states like California, New York, et cetera, which didn't get him any more electoral votes, but did pad his popular vote lead. So basically in 2012, for whatever reason, the Obama election, you had a much more even distribution across the states. That's why even though it wasn't technically as close in the popular vote, it was actually not, it was even more of a widespread win in the electoral vote. Okay? So the reason why there was any, I guess, talk about, this election being, it had to be adjudicated and all this kind of stuff is this right here, is that it was close in the Electoral College. It wasn't really close in several other ways, but it was close in this sense. Okay, now, so just to kind of summarize before I move on, Biden's win, how decisive was it? Well, again, not a landslide, not a nail-biter. In popular vote terms, it was very decisive. In electoral vote terms, it was a lot closer. Okay, now what I have on screen is assessing democracy. I just wanted to go through these so that we can kind of remind ourselves, what does it take to make for a healthy democracy? And similar to something else I talked about, the VAP versus the VAP, I see these slightly different other political scientists, but generally these are the 7 basic things. So it's election of major public offices based on free and fair elections. Here's the issue. Here's, the source of this tension and conflict. We have to say, though, 63 cases were put forth by the Trump campaign. They lost 62 of them. International observers, state and local officials, many of whom were Republicans themselves, even Trump's own government, had all reached the conclusion there was a free and fair election. So, I'm not sure where you go from there. Basically, there's so much evidence on one side of this question. The right of all adults to vote. Well, the good news is 66% or so voted in this election. That's extremely high. I think it's the highest in over 100 years. On the other hand, we still have questions about voter suppression, about methods of voting, and all these other kinds of things that kind of keep us on the edge about our democracy. Political parties are free to compete in elections. That wasn't really that big of an issue here, although in general, I will say that it is a big issue for anyone who's not a Democrat or Republican. They sometimes find it hard to compete in elections. 4, government operates by equitable and relatively open procedures. This was another point of contention, but again, people saying, well, the vote counting was done in secret or whatever. Well, again, there's just not a whole lot of evidence to support that. I mean, I remember election week watching on CNN or C-SPAN, watching them count the votes in Pennsylvania. They had cameras right there. So it's hard to argue that this was anything but an open process. Protection of political rights and civil liberties, we'll probably touch on that a little later in the program. But I want to really focus on the last two because these are extremely important. Judiciary with power independent of the executive and the legislative. Those 63 cases were heard by a very various kinds of judges. They weren't all Democrat, they weren't all liberal, some were Republican, some were extremely conservative, some were appointed by Trump. And except for one relatively minor case, they all came to the same conclusion that this election followed constitutional procedures. So having that kind of judiciary there was very important bulwark in favor of our democracy. Additionally, having civilian control of the military. And what we mean by that is that the military takes an oath, as most officials of the government do, to the Constitution of the United States. It is not going to take sides in some kind of dispute, and it's personally not going to take sides against constitutionally prescribed procedures. That's very, very important. If we had a situation where the military did take sides, well, we'd have probably a civil war. We'd probably have a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime, etc. So, we can certainly be thankful that we had these last two conditions that firmly held in this particular instance. Following through constitutional order, the legal process, etc. Okay, and there are my sources. Please ask me any questions about this as we go along, but now I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Alexa Royden.
Hello, everybody. I think I have unmuted myself. Yes. Okay, excellent. Well, let me share my screen, and with any luck, I will actually get the correct file up. I want to talk a little bit about white supremacy and some of the violence, put into context some of the violence that we saw at the Capitol last Wednesday. Let me see if this will actually, there we go. I'm going to go use a regular slideshow. Okay, so white supremacy is something that has been very constant in American life for hundreds of years. This is nothing new. When I was working in the 1990s, we were studying and tracking and doing work on the threat posed by white supremacists. So this is not particularly new. However, I'm sure you've seen a lot of terminology in the media, and what I want to do is be very precise as we walk through this. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you have later. First of all, we see the word terrorism used extensively, and so I thought I'd just go over what that what that means. There are many definitions of terrorism. Many of them are legal definitions by various departments so that when an offense occurs, the crime can be tried. But the base definition that is common to almost all of them includes the following. Terrorism is the use of violence, all right? And that's really important. So violence is a broad spectrum. It can be intimidation. It can be everything up to actually using bombs, weapons, etc. The target, and this is really key, is that terrorism uses violence against civilians or non-combatants, okay? So who is a civilian? A civilian is essentially anyone who is not authorized in a conflict environment to engage in that conflict, all right? So it's worth noting that members of our government are considered non-combatants. I'm afraid that I have to say that, but it's important to note. Last but not least, terrorism uses violence against civilians to achieve a political outcome. All right, so violence that is used against civilians, but there's no political goal, is not terrorism, okay? So I just want to reiterate that. We experience a lot of violence in this country, and it's important to discriminate between random acts of violence and politically motivated acts of violence. It is also worth noting that terrorism is a tactic, all right? So when we think about terrorism, we often think, sort of associated with a group of people, but people across the political and ideological and religious spectrum can use terrorism. It is not unique to specific groups, all right? Now, just a little bit about white nationalism, because this is a problem that we've been having for, pretty much most of our history, but it's very pertinent today because there is a global white nationalist movement. All right, so what is the political goal, right? We just talked about the fact that terrorism requires a political goal. Not all white nationalist groups use violence, but those who do are seeking to establish a white ethno-state, okay? So they want the government, they want the majority of the population to be white. They are explicitly racist, they are explicitly anti-Semitic, they target groups that are not Christian. There is confluence between white nationalism and Christian nationalism, all right? White nationalists seek to influence political issues, okay? So it's not just blowing things up. White nationalist groups have been targeting the mainstream right to influence the issues that they prioritize. And those issues include things like immigration and Christian supremacy, okay? And certainly, of course, are anti-multiculturalist. White nationalism is clearly a fascist and racist global movement. And I want to emphasize that because it's not just happening here. It's happening in many of our allied countries. And there is a lot of diverse support by many foreign actors for white nationalist movements. Now, I wanted to give you a quote from a US Homeland Threat Assessment that was put out by the Department of Homeland Security. And this is from October of 2020. And it essentially argues that, let me move this over. Sorry, I'm having some, all right. It essentially argues that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. So the most persistent domestic threat today, as identified by our intelligence community and our law enforcement community, is white nationalist extremism, okay? So that's important. Now, oops, as always, I have done something odd. Oops, okay. So I wanted to show you a couple of graphs that demonstrate the long-term activities of white nationalists. Now, this graph actually represents not the number of attacks, but the percentage of total attacks each year by group. So it goes back to 1994 and it runs through August of 2020. Okay, this is reports that is done by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is an incredibly well-regarded group. You can see that from the 1990s through to today, white supremacist violence, essentially far-right violence, has been very common, all right? And in all fairness, this also includes not just white supremacist violence, but anti-government violence and violence by incel groups or involuntary celibates. That is more recent in this area, but the profile of the people who commit these acts is pretty consistent. So you have far-right groups, you have far-left groups. You see that there's a bump in violence around 2001 with far-left groups. I should point out, though, that the number of incidents in this area is fairly low. Then you see these religious groups, and most of that is referring to, religious groups such as Islamic fundamentalist groups, etc. And then, of course, there's always a little squidgy other at the top, somebody who's doing something crazy for whatever reason. Although I should point out, terrorism is rarely executed by crazy people. It's generally executed by people with a clear goal who have decided it's in their interest to use violence to get to win what they want to win. All right, the next graph essentially shows you the number of terrorist attacks that have taken place from January to August of this year, okay? We will have more, obviously more data sooner rather than later, but you can see that even this year, overwhelmingly acts of terrorism have been perpetrated by violent far-right organizations. So there's a difference between like 11 or 12 and over 40. That's significant. Last year, as you may know, we had a number of incidents where protests got out of hand. The majority of people who were killed in those protests were actually left-wing protesters. So, I'm happy to talk about that, but there has been significantly more violence on the right than on the left. And last but not least, because I want to make sure Aaron has a little time to chat here, our current situation, white supremacists are a minority on the right wing. This is not the average conservative. This is not the average Republican. This is a minority group. However, white supremacist ideas are becoming mainstreamed, and that's a concern. Undermining the legitimacy of the recent election absolutely advances the goals of these white supremacist groups and their attempt to form a white ethno-state, delegitimizing electoral processes is really key. This is a really complex thing to talk about, and I'm happy to talk about it later, but white supremacist groups actively seek to recruit and penetrate military and law enforcement. This has been ongoing for decades. So again, I'm happy to chat about that. And white supremacist violence is genuinely a real national security threat, and it needs to be addressed collectively by the entire government, regardless of political affiliation, and all of our social and religious organizations. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand it over to Aaron, who will finish this up for us.
Thank you, Alexa. I do not have slides. Looks like I'm still sharing your screen.
Oops, hold on. Of course we are. Stop share. Hold on, my stop share is getting blocked by something. Here we go. There we go. That should help.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Alexa. And thanks everyone for joining us today for talking about this important topic. The first thing I want to say is that, the intended audience for my talk is you all, I hope, and I have some assumptions about you. My assumptions are that we share a commitment to democracy as the form of government that we want to have in the U.S. and that's the best and most morally correct form of government. And the other assumption I have about you is that you care about pursuing truth and discerning truth through empirical methods. That we share a commitment to deciding what's true based on what's observable, what we can all measure and agree upon together. And that's where we come from truth, decide what truth is. So that's my assumption about you all. If that doesn't describe you, then this talk isn't aimed for you. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about where we are. So I want to talk about here, and then I'm going to talk about how did we get here, and where do we go from here. So first, the here. Where is here? Last Wednesday, January 6th, was a really big deal. I don't think we can overstate how important what happened was. there was an armed mob that infiltrated the Capitol and interrupted Congress from doing its constitutionally mandated business, which was to officially certify who the next president of the United States was going to be. That is a really big deal, and it's deeply concerning. And that it happened is a failure, and it's a failure by every one of us on this call. It's a failure of those who tried to warn the country that this was a possibility, because they failed to sound the alarm to get people to stop it from happening. It's a failure of the people who were indifferent to those cries of alarm and said, "Oh, you're alarmist. You're making things up. There's no big deal," because you're wrong about that. And it was a failure, certainly, of those who were complicit in whatever way with the attacks themselves. And the other thing about where we are that I want to note, and this leads into the rest of the talk, is that this wasn't a singular trauma. This wasn't a car crash that came out of nowhere, right? A deer runs in front of your car as you're driving down the road. No one could see that coming, and and it's over. It's an episode that's now over, and you have some injuries, but once you heal from those, it's over. No, this is more akin to someone who goes to the bar and spends 4 hours a night drinking their sorrows away, and then gets in their car and drives 50 miles every night. This was a long time coming, and if we don't do stuff to address the underlying causes, we're going to remain in the status quo that brought us January 6th. So that's my take on here. So how did we get here? I want to talk about two different aspects of U.S. politics here. First, and more quickly, talk about political institutions. So one thing to note, and Mark especially hit on this already, is that the U.S. has a two-party system, and it's a pretty strong two-party system in that it's hard for additional parties to break through. And that is principally a consequence of our institutions. And the main two institutions that lead to that result are, one, our voting method that we use. We use a voting method called first past the post, alternative called plurality wins. And that's a voting method that tends to lead to just two main parties or candidates in a given race. The second institutional feature of U.S. politics that leads to two parties is our use of presidentialism. Because we have this huge prize out there of the U.S. presidency, that is what parties want to win. That's the ultimate prize. And so it makes all elections sort of also cast their eyes towards this singular office. And so because of our institutions, we tend to have a pretty strong two-party system, and it's hard for third or fourth parties to break in. The other thing to note about the institutions of U.S. government is that in contemporary politics, our institutions provide an advantage to the Republican Party. So currently, given the voting patterns in the various states and the advantage that the Senate and then by extension the Electoral College gives to rural areas, and even the way we district for the U.S. House of Representatives, Republicans are able to translate a given percentage of the vote into more power, into more seats in the U.S. government. And so, so the Republicans, for instance, are Joe Biden, as Dr. Kelso explained, won 7 million more votes than President Trump did, and yet it was very close in the Electoral College, and some 30,000 people switching the way they voted from Biden to Donald Trump, allocated in the right way, would have meant a different result for the election. So those are two institutional features to keep in mind. One, the strong two-party system, and then that U.S. institutions give a slight advantage, kind of a home court advantage, if you will, to the Republican Party in contemporary U.S. politics. And then I want to move and talk about some contemporary issues in political behavior in U.S. politics. We're in a time of hyperpolarization. The parties today have very ideologically distinct and distant positions from each other. So in the past, in the 20th century, in U.S. politics, you had some ideological overlap between the parties. You would have conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And for a variety of reasons we don't really need to get into, but a lot that has to do with the US South that we live in, the parties have sorted ideologically. And so today, conservatives are almost exclusively Republicans, liberals almost exclusively Democrats, and the parties are distinct. And they are evenly matched, and because they're ideologically distinct, they feel like the stakes in elections are really high, and it leads to this situation of polarization between the parties. One of the consequences of polarization, intense polarization, hyperpolarization, can be what scholars call constitutional hardball. You can call it norm erosion. So democracy relies on certain kind of rules of the road that aren't written down into law. They're not formal requirements that we do these things, but they're just kind of understandings, sort of the house rules. You go into an ice cream parlor and you don't fill up on free samples because that's just not what you do. There's not necessarily a law against it or a rule against it. Some ice cream parlors may say limit 2 samples. That's because they had a customer come in and said, oh, free sample, free sample, free. They had a norm. Someone tried to exploit that norm and take 12 free samples, and so they changed it and made a rule. U.S. politics lives on a lot of norms. And in a time of hyperpolarization, there's a strong incentive for the parties to violate longstanding norms if it serves their political interests and their policy interests. And we've seen that. It is true that both parties have violated important longstanding norms, but it's also true, and it's important to know that this polarization, the consequences of polarization have been asymmetric. The Republican Party has violated more norms and violated those norms more aggressively than has the Democratic Party over time. The Republican Party in the aggregate, this isn't true of every Republican voter, every Republican politician, but in the aggregate, the Republican Party has been willing to erode important norms, including important democratic norms, in order to secure political victories. One of the norms that the Republican Party has allowed to be eroded is this mainstreaming of extremist views that Dr. Royden was talking about. So there are certain views out there that are, frankly, to use a charged word, deplorable. And we recognize them as deplorable. Denying the equal rights of people based on their race or religion or ethnic background is something that is inconsistent with American democratic values. It's deplorable. And the Republican Party has been willing to include in its coalition voters who have those sorts of views, knowing that they have those sorts of views. And that coalition of Republican voters has taken advantage of the sort of home court advantage of US political institutions to win power. Now, sort of the more mainstream Republicans thought that they could control this beast, these deplorables. And for a while, they did. John McCain famously in 2008 kind of didn't shout down, but talked down a supporter who was giving voice to some conspiracy theories about Barack Obama. But John McCain also chose Sarah Palin as his vice presidential candidate, who expressed many of these sympathies with a lot of these views. Mitt Romney has made the news in recent days for standing up against the lies about the election fraud and standing up against what happened on January 6th. But in 2012, Mitt Romney flew to Las Vegas to receive the endorsement in person of one Donald J. Trump, who at that time was known for nothing in politics other than promoting birtherism. So John McCain and Mitt Romney, who are held up today by people as, oh, here are models of what we want to see as Republicans, with good reason, because they were mainly committed to democracy. They themselves contributed to this feeding of the beast. They thought they had the beast on the leash, but they didn't. In a system with two parties, it's easy to take over one of those parties, and then if that party is the one that has home court advantage, you can take over the government. And that's largely what happened. And Republican voters, a large portion of them, were satisfied with this. And Republican politicians are going to respond to the incentives that voters give them. And so, I don't think that Lindsey Graham, it's hard to know what is true, what a genuine belief of Lindsey Graham is, but I don't know that Lindsey Graham is genuinely a supporter of Donald Trump. In 2016, he had some pretty harsh words for then candidate Donald Trump. He had some harsh words for him on January 6th as well, before seeming to turn his views again. Politicians respond to incentives, and the incentives given them by voters. So that's a very quick rundown of my take on how we got here, and then finally, where do we go from here? If you want to change the status quo, if the status quo that gave us January 6th is something that's unacceptable to you, there are two paths forward. One is, for norms to be followed, they must be enforced. And to enforce norms, you have to punish those who violate the norms. Too often, those who say they want these norms to be followed by politicians allow norm violations to go by without any punishment for the politicians who did it. And politicians are going to respond to incentives. So if we, the people, don't hold our politicians accountable for violating the norms, those norms are going to go away. And it's on us to enforce norms against politicians and in politics. So that's kind of the behavioral side of things to change the status quo. The institutional side is to change the structures of government. There are things that can be done structurally to make it easier for third or fourth parties to win races. There are things that can be done in the structures of government to make U.S. politics more democratic, meaning that majorities, when they exist, are more likely to win power and be able to express that power in the system. So there are behavioral changes that can happen to change the status quo, and institutional changes that can happen to change the status quo. But I'll leave it on a note that I feel very confident that this is an accurate description of the country. I don't think even after January 6th, I think the vast majority of Americans have the same views they did on January 5th. Trump supporters still support Donald Trump by and large. Opponents of Donald Trump still oppose him. Most people haven't changed their mind, even after last week's traumatic events. But the question is going to be, have enough people change their mind to make a difference? The country is very closely divided, and there's a small slice of people who are persuadable, who do change their minds, and how they see things is really how things get done in U.S. politics. So I'll end there and open it up for questions, unless Dr. Kelso or Dr. Royden have anything they want to kind of add on before we go to questions.
Nope, questions. Let's do that.
All right, well, you seem very excited about that. So this first one's going to be for you, Dr. Royden. Any idea of what led to the spike of the far left instances of violence in the early 2000s?
I'd actually have to go in and look at the data, and I apologize. I haven't done that. My instinct, though, is that there were comparatively few incidents. If you look at the early 2000 period, that was right around 9/11, and we were really focused on other things. So my suspicion is that, what you saw that spike in that one chart, it's the percentage of attacks, but my guess is there were very few attacks, if that makes any sense. I'd have to back that up, and I'll look it up and certainly, let you know if you're interested. So
great, thank you. We did have one question about what is the government role versus the business role in freedom of speech, especially in regard to Twitter and everything that's been going on since the events of January 6th.
Well, Aaron, you have a law degree. You want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to look for the question itself in the chat to make sure I addressed all parts of it. Free speech, the First Amendment, there's a difference between the free speech as a notion and as a value that we want to promote and First Amendment protections of free speech. So free speech is something that Queens values, that different discussion forums can value, that there's a moral value or an intellectual value to allowing people free reign and expression of ideas. There's a thought that there's a marketplace of ideas, and we want to allow kind of unfettered competition in that marketplace so that the best ideas, including new ideas, can come forward. And so that's just a value that intellectual and social communities have had for a long time, or not had in many societies. But that's the value that is behind. It's the logic behind the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that protects individuals from having their rights of free expression, free speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly to be infringed by the government. It's a right that has been extended to protect individuals from all levels of government in the U.S. So it's the federal government and from state government and local governments as well, and any sort of government actor. So what that means is that the government, oops, sorry, I managed to lower myself in the chair. That means that the government cannot punish you for expressing ideas. And if they do, they're violating your First Amendment free speech protections. There are certain types of speech that are basically unprotected or less protected. And so one of those is incitement of illegal activity. And so if you are basically getting ready to start some sort of violence or disorder, that can be considered an incitement to illegal activity. My view of what happened last week in the rally that was the precursor to the attacks on the Capitol was that would be very tough to bring criminal charges against President Trump or anyone else for incitement of illegal activity. He was not explicit in saying, let's be violent in the Capitol, let's kill a Capitol police officer, named Brian Sicknick, let's do violence. He said, let's march to the Capitol. That's to me, protected political speech. So when it comes to some sort of criminal prosecution for that speech, the U.S. has very strong protections. The First Amendment gives very strong protections compared to other countries. And I think that speech would be protected on criminal grounds. Now, the standard for whether someone can be impeached and removed as president doesn't, Alan Dershowitz, my criminal law professor aside, I don't think that the First Amendment, protects a president from making speech that would incite a riot as a defense from being impeached and removed from office. When it comes to things like Twitter or Facebook and media companies, these are they're private organizations. The First Amendment does not protect you against private entities or private individuals. So they can change their policies as they see fit, and they're not violating your First Amendment rights. They may be operating contrary to free speech principles, but they're not, violating the First Amendment. They can't violate the First Amendment. Government can try to regulate those sorts of operators to require them to do certain things or require them not to do other things, but the First Amendment doesn't apply to private actors.
I'd also like to add, sorry, Aaron, I'd also like to add that it is worth noting that what happened with Twitter and social media is called deplatforming, and we routinely deplatform actors who are engaging in, coordination of violence, etc. We have a long, really good, we have a lot of experience with deplatforming, for instance, radical Islamic actors who are attempting to, foment violence. So this is just the white supremacists are kind of getting a taste of it. And unfortunately, for good or ill, they're the minority, but the activity that is taking place on these social media platforms are really being amplified. And that's why you're seeing some of that being culled. But it can be quite successful. Deplatforming is a tool that we use when we're dealing with terrorism. So.
Thank you both for breaking that down. This next one is a little bit open-ended, so any one of you three can jump in on it. But this person asked, is it true that we are or are close to losing our democracy?
I'll take that one. Yes. The short answer is yes. What happened on January 6th, we were very, very fortunate it didn't get worse. We could have literally had elected officials from Nancy Pelosi to Vice President Pence to any number of people in the Congress. They could have been killed. I'm not saying everybody who was there had that plan, but certainly there were some who had that plan. And who knows what would have happened from that point onward. So the short answer is yes. And I want to actually follow up in my answer on something that Dr. Houck or Aaron said. Donald Trump, whether he incited this riot or not, he broke one of the fundamental norms of American politics when he did not concede this election. Almost every president, certainly in the last 100 years or so, has conceded, even when they had some legitimate grounds for not conceding. Richard Nixon in 1960 had, he had people telling him the votes in Texas and Illinois were so fraudulent. But he said, to his credit, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move on. I'm going to concede. Al Gore in 2000, many of us remember that night. After the Supreme Court made its ruling, he said, I don't agree with this, but I'm going to concede. Hillary Clinton the next day conceded, and Barack Obama invited Trump to the White House that same week. So, that's one of those norms that is very dangerous to start ignoring. In addition to everything else, and I think the events at the Capitol on January 6th could not have happened if Trump had come out and said, yes, I lost the election.
And sorry, just to add on a little bit, again, to encourage people not to only be backward looking, there's National Guard troops stationed in the Capitol right now. And there are various law enforcement and military type personnel prepared for what could happen on January 20th as well, because the people who made threats about January 6th are making threats about Inauguration Day as well. January 6th wasn't inevitable, right? It wasn't even necessarily likely, but it's not totally surprising. It was a low probability event with a horrible consequence that was too likely, right? And more violence on Inauguration Day may also be a low probability event, but it's not nearly as close to zero as it needs to be. And so I am not predicting violence on Inauguration Day, but we can't assume that the car crash happened on January 6th and we're out of the woods now and just nursing our broken leg.
Thank you both for that. I'm gonna sort of put two of these questions together because they do go hand in hand. So the first part of the question is it fair to lump all Republicans into the quote unquote deplorable category? And this person noted, not all Republicans do bad things. And another person asked, is the Republican Party too deep with the quote unquote deplorables? Meaning, how can the party maintain voting power without them, if that makes sense? So 2 parts there.
I will take a quick stab at that by saying, of course, it is not fair to lump all Republicans in with a violent extremist movement. However, I think it is incumbent upon Republicans and conservatives who value democracy and decency and the peaceful transition of power to publicly, loudly reject the elements within their own party who are really undermining our democratic government and traditions. And there's not enough of that. After the siege in the Capitol, we still had senators who know better stand up and say the election was fraudulent. We had members of the House of Representatives vote not to certify the election. So 100%, I speak as someone who is an politically independent, who comes from a conservative home. I feel passionately that we should not paint with a single brush, but at the same time, these groups have taken up a large space, even if not by number, but by ideas within the Republican Party. And those ideas need to be rejected. And they need to be rejected by all conservatives. Okay, so do I think the Republican Party is too far gone? No, actually in the last week, I've been very impressed by, some very courageous Republicans speaking out. And a number of Republicans have confided, at least according to, fairly mainstream news reports, that they feel threatened by speaking out. That's a problem. So, absolutely not. I would say the vast majority of conservatives are peaceful, democracy-loving citizens, but they need to start looking around and dealing honestly with what is happening in their party. And I will leave it at that and let, Mark and Aaron, who are more learned in American politics, speak.
Yeah, I would agree with Alexa. And, let's not forget, we had 10 Republican members of Congress, including the number 3 ranking Republican, take a very courageous vote yesterday, and they should be applauded for that. We have Republican governors in states like Maryland, Vermont, Ohio, Massachusetts, who from the beginning have called this out as ridiculous. So there are some very good Republicans out there. And I agree with Alexa. The voices need to be louder. One thing I want to add, though, is the Republican Party made this choice. There was a report from the internal party report that said that after the election of Barack Obama, what the Republican Party needs to do, it needs to moderate some of its policies so that it will be more viable with more of the population, specifically racial and ethnic minorities, women, younger voters, etc. They explicitly rejected that and went in the complete opposite direction. And that was a conscious choice. It was a wrong choice, not only morally, but electorally. And I hope, just like Alexa, I hope the Republican Party with the leadership of some of the people I just mentioned, will kind of move in the direction. You can still be conservative. Nobody's saying you shouldn't be conservative in social economic policy or whatever, but you have to say this white supremacy and its related viewpoints is just not acceptable.
If I can add on to that, I think maybe I'm a little more pessimistic than either of my colleagues on this. I think when you look at the data, you find that strong majorities of the Republican respondents to surveys, either blame Biden for what happened last week. They still believe that the election was fraudulent. They support, everything that Donald Trump has done, through his speech before the attack on the Capitol. It's not a 50-50 call in among Republican voters. That's, you know, it's not 100%, but it's a majority of Republican voters that have been captured by this faction, and that's deeply problematic. I don't think that Mitch McConnell sincerely, believes that there was election fraud. I don't think that Kevin McCarthy sincerely believes that. I don't think Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, who I was in a wedding party with, sincerely believe that there was election fraud. They are following incentives given them by their voters, and that's a problem. And it is absolutely essential that we have at least two well-functioning parties in our country. We need a center-right party. We need a conservative party to compete with a liberal party. It's absolutely essential. But it has to be a party that's committed to democracy. And right now you are seeing a battle for the soul of the Republican Party playing out, and you are seeing the politicians who respond to incentives putting their finger in the air to see what they should do. Is Mitt Romney going to be rewarded for his courage? And I hate to use that word because it's akin to my praising my 11-year-old son for being able to tie his shoes, right? For being able to say that it's daytime outside when the sun is in the air. I don't know that that's courage, despite all the incentives to lie and say it's nighttime. But is Mitt Romney going to be rewarded? Is Liz Cheney going to be rewarded for what she's done? Or is she going to go the way of Jeff Flake, who several years ago tried to stand up to this wing of the party and say, this is not who we are as conservatives. This isn't conservative. Donald Trump isn't conservative. He's a radical, upsetting all sorts of longstanding, important traditionalist values of our country. Jeff Flake is now considered a rhino. The Arizona Republican Party had to vote to censure him and John McCain's widow and the governor for certifying the election results. That's the reality of where the Republican Party is. And so it's those Republicans or conservatives, maybe they'll have to break away and form their own party, but I need to see from them, and I would, I'm obviously giving my opinion here, they need to show a stronger commitment to democratic values and norms and principles than political wins. Because guess what? If their coalition falls apart and the non-deplorables, of which there are many in the Republican Party, split from the deplorables for a time, at least in the short run, they're going to lose elections to Democrats. They're going to lose policy battles to Democrats. And that has got to be a cost that they're willing to pay to protect and preserve our democracy. Our democracy is more important than keeping corporate tax rates low.
Thank you all. I know that we are at the end and some folks might have to jump off a little bit early. So I do want to say thank you everyone to your questions. I know we weren't able to get to all of them. Obviously, I mean, I don't want to offer up any of you for something that you don't want to do, but I know that our professors, Dr. Hauk, Dr. Royden, Dr. Kelso, are more than happy to be in conversation with you over the next few weeks if you still have questions that didn't get answered today. And if you are interested in learning a little bit more about future Lunch and Learn events, you can follow us on Instagram at @QU_votes. And I wanted to say thank you to the panelists for being on today, and also end with this question, which is, this is kind of a really depressing topic, and there is a lot at stake for the future of the country and the ramifications of the events from January 6th. So what are you all hopeful for as we move forward out of this really tumultuous period? I mean, there's still a pandemic going on. There are still other issues that kind of were overshadowed by this one huge event. So we're, working our way out of that, but what are you all hopeful for going forward?
So I'm going to say it like this. I'm not hopeful. I think most people in the U.S. Have the same views they had on January 5th. I think those median voters, those marginal voters, those pivotal voters are satisfied with the status quo. I think they want to see the people who were in the Capitol destroying property and endangering lives and killing lives, taking lives. They want to see them punished. They maybe want to see some informal consequences for Donald Trump, but they don't want to make real changes to how they punish norm violations. They don't want to make real changes to institutions in American politics. And so that's going to leave us with the status quo that took us to January 6th. That was the culmination of 4 or 5 years of Donald Trump's dominance of the Republican Party, which was itself the culmination of decades of Republican strategies to attract those types of voters. So I'm not hopeful for the future. And so my hope is that you will actually do something to spite my pessimism.
Okay. Wow. I appreciate that, because there are days where I look at what's happening and I find it really difficult to believe that we are going to be able to right this ship. Where I am actually hopeful is seeing major actors within society making some decisions that are painful. For instance, and this sounds terrible, but major companies withdrawing advertising, the deplatforming of really ugly social media. Is this a one-off? Is it all going to go away in a week or two? I hope not, but I am hoping that we hold all of our elected officials to higher standards. And seriously, we are the democracy that we deserve. So if you want to know where things are going wrong, we need to look in the mirror first. And I think this is a time where we need a lot of truth-telling and a lot of reflection. And I think we're capable of it. And I hope we have the courage to do it. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, well, I'll be more optimistic here. First of all, we have to consider, from my earlier point, 81 million people voted for Joe Biden. A higher percentage of Americans voted for him than any of the last 10 elections. The Republican Party has lost every election since 1992 in the popular vote. They realize, and this is part of, we didn't even get to this, but this is part of what's driving them. They see the writing on the wall. They cannot win the popular vote, in most elections, most presidential elections. Furthermore, what is hopeful to me is that if you look at the demographic changes in America, younger people and different kinds of people from various different groups, they're not going to accept white supremacy. So I think that to some extent, the demographic changes will help mitigate this. I also think, just to follow up on what Alexa said, something that has happened, and if they stick with this, this is huge. Major corporations are saying, we will not give money to any of the people who question the certification of the election. That would be devastating to the Republican Party, because they do not have quite the ability of the Democrats to raise money in a kind of grassroots fashion. And they probably have even less of that ability as Donald Trump fades from the scene. So we're at a dark time. I think we can get through this. I am hopeful that the Republican Party, just based on pure politics, they will have to change their tune. And I'm hopeful that we'll strengthen democracy in the future rather than weaken it.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Kelso, Dr. Houck, and Dr. Royden, for sharing your very necessary and timely insights on what happened last week and what it might look like moving forward. So with that, we will end our first Lunch and Learn of 2021. Thank you, everyone, for joining.